Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Funding the Long Game in Collective Impact. I'm Jennifer Slansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Institute. And we are so delighted to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining. Before we dive into our conversation, I'm just going to spend a few minutes orienting you to today's session. Our conversation today will run for roughly 60 minutes. We'll spend about the first half of our time today hearing from our speakers and the second half of the time fielding questions from you all. You can put your questions in the box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll sort them and get through as many as time allows. In addition, as you can note that this session is being recorded, and you will get a link to the recording later today or tomorrow, so you can refer back to it or share it with others in your network that you think may find it interesting. In addition, you are able to download the slides from today's session on your webinar app. There's a little handout section on the webinar, and there is a PDF version of today's materials. So definitely feel free to do that if you'd like to access the hard copy of the slides. So let's go on to the next page. So just a reminder, please use the Q&A box to ask questions. You're welcome to and encouraged to share on social media. A couple of our hashtags are here on the screen. And you can actually use that question box for both content-related questions and technical questions. That's probably the best way to get a question answered. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I would love to welcome today our three guests. Moderating today's discussion is Paul Schmitz. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as Senior Advisor at the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of Leading Inside Out. He is an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and results-based strategies. He's also the author of the case study that is the work that we'll be talking about today. Joining Paul in today's discussion are Christina, Ellis, and Tim Meister. Christina is the Program Director for the Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She is responsible for overseeing the funding and programming of the endowment's focus on community health improvement. Tim is the Program Manager responsible for managing the Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment's initiative on community-based behavioral health. The Advancing Behavioral Health Initiative is an 8-year, $20 million investment in improving the behavioral health of communities across the state of Wisconsin, and we will spend much more time talking about that today. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Great. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm going to actually hand it over to Christina and Tim. We're just going to give a little background on the endowment, and then I'll be sharing a little bit more about this unique program that we covered in the case study, and then beginning Q&A with Tim and Christina, after which we'll invite questions from the field. So Christina and Tim, do you want to start with sharing with us about just some background on the endowment and who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Paul. So yes, a little bit of information about the Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment. We are a conversion fund, and we are rooted in the Medical College of Wisconsin. We began funding in 2004, and since that time have invested over $260 million into improving health in Wisconsin. We've had over 430 separate initiatives funded through that $260 million, and we fund the vast majority of our efforts through a community academic partnership model. And so we've worked with over 1,000 community organizations as well as hundreds of academic partners on those initiatives. Currently, the size of the endowment is roughly at about $450 million. Next slide, please. So the way that we work through our funding initiatives is really spread across these 4 areas, which we call our pathways for partners. And those are really the ways that grantees intersect with us. So we fund through a variety of mechanisms, and as you can see here on these pathways, we fund everything from basic research and biomedical research, medical provider and healthcare education, and improving the workforce, population and community health initiatives and studies, and then we have a large emphasis on systems change. Next slide, please.
One thing that we'd like to emphasize is that we as an endowment made a move a number of years ago from being a grant maker to being a change maker. And in fact, that was the title of our third 5-year plan. Really, the main point or takeaway there is that in the past, our grant making posture was much more transactional. As the funding got initiated in 2004, there was an initial rush to kind of just get some money out the door and fund some good projects. And after about a decade of learning and experience, we as an organization learned that we could maybe go further with some, if we went a little bit deeper. And thus our change making strategy was born, and that really gave birth to this initiative and what led to making it possible. Next slide.
So as the endowment undertook this initiative, one of the issues they decided to take on was behavioral health and to apply kind of a change-making lens versus a traditional grant-making lens. And that's really what the report and the rest will be about. And I'll walk through now kind of what makes this grant program different than what we've often seen, and frankly, much more supportive of collective impact than what we've seen. Next slide, please. So with this, the first and most important headline is that the endowment made a commitment of $20 million over 8 years to 10 community coalitions across the state, each of which are working to move some behavioral health population level measure in their region. And they also fund one academic partner team, and we'll talk about that a little later, about the value add that brings to the initiative. Next slide, please, Robert. The grant, this 8 years has 3 distinct phases. And I think one of the most interesting things about this initiative is that coalitions were brought in based on their ability to organize a coalition and their interest and willingness to participate in this initiative, but they didn't have a proposal for what they were actually going to do. And so the first year was a funded learning and planning phase. After that, they have 5 years of implementation of that plan they developed during the first year, and then 2 years of really a transition period to figure out how to sustain the change and work they've been doing and move forward. And so overall, it's an 8-year grant period, roughly $200,000 a year for the first 6 years and $150,000 a year for the next 2. Next slide, Robert. The second thing, besides the term of the grant, the notion of an 8-year grant structured that way, is this planning year. During that planning year, there was a monthly learning community where 3 representatives of each of the 10 coalitions and the academic partner came together every month to do community building, capacity building, and planning. The capacity building was both based on helping them utilize data to develop their common agendas and strategies and their proposals, but we also focused on skills around community engagement and racial equity and collaborative culture building and organizing and facilitating meetings, and work to build their capacity to build the culture of their collective. And so these monthly gatherings were both kind of planning, capacity building, and then of course with them community building, because they were all working together. The other thing that was really important was the peer support and staff feedback, is that as groups developed their results, their strategies, their proposals, they would present them to their peers and get feedback from the staff at the foundation as well as the peers. And they went through several rounds of peer and staff feedback before submitting the final proposal, which went to the board and the endowment. And again, not many grantees have the opportunity to get feedback from their peers and from the staff before in several rounds before bringing it forward. And I thought that was just such a distinct and important piece of this work that most grantees never get to really do. And that feedback really helped steer people. The other thing that I think is important here is that provided the groups participated fully in the process and developed rigorous strategies, they would be funded. And so it wasn't that there were 12 groups competing for 10 slots. There were 10 groups, and they all would get funded if they met all the criteria. If someone didn't met the criteria, they wouldn't have been funded. But They were basically, in a way, pre-approved, and that took out a lot of often the competition and things that these processes have. Let's move to the third slide. The next one, I mean. So the third thing that made this distinct is the learning community. The first year it met every month, and since the first year it meets every quarter, and it rotates across communities. Yesterday we were actually in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We're in Milwaukee, which is about 3.5 hours west on the Mississippi River, and had all the learning community there for their quarterly gathering. And the quarterly learning community among the grantees is a place that blends learning from the host community. They present what they're doing and some of the best practices from their community. We also continue to do capacity building and then peer support across projects. So just as an example, the last 2 days, the first day was spent learning a lot about lacrosse and about the behavioral health work they were doing. They brought in a panel of local leaders. They shared 2 workshops on things they've been developing locally. But then we had a trainer come in and do fundraising and sustainability training in the morning the next day as a form of capacity building. We also had a peer support process, which we use the World Cafe process, where the communities were sharing information with each other. We also had a theater presentation. So a lot of different things that we do in these communities that build relationships, but also continue building capacity and sharing across communities. And finally, there's collaboration across communities, that because they've built such strong relationships and know each other's work, they're constantly pulling on each other and borrowing from each other and contacting each other for support. And so the learning community happens not just when we bring them together every quarter, but it happens outside of that as they continue to collaborate all year long. Let's move to the next slide. The fourth is that there's this academic partner, and what the Medical Colleges Endowment does is that they fund a team of academic faculty who then are available to the grantees in an ongoing way for a variety of support, whether it's gathering and analyzing data, helping them conduct and design evaluations, building capacity in other ways, sharing community engagement strategies, a variety of things they're able to do. And so they have that support of this team available to them throughout the project. The second is that there's a pool of funds the endowment made available to these grantees for other forms of technical capacity building, things like fundraising or board development or community engagement. And they have a number of kind of identified trainers and experts in these fields who the grantees can access, and this is in addition to their grants, if they need help in specific functions that will help them, again, strengthen the work that they're doing. And finally, the program officer, Tim, meets with the grantees every month, and now some of them it's bi-monthly, to provide really thought partnership and support. These aren't meetings to kind of check boxes and get compliance. They're meetings to find out how things are going and how to support their success. And that's a big difference, again, between how a lot of us who've gotten grants haven't had grant makers we could call once a month and just kind of think through what we're working on and what struggles and challenges we're facing and what progress we're making and get access to other help, which is something, again, that's just very different from the way most grants work. And next slide, Robert. The fifth and final thing that's unique about this project is that there's an annual conference funded by the endowment where the learning community designs it to share what they're learning and what they want to learn with the wider behavioral health field in the state. It's limited to about 200 people a year. The endowment sponsors 100% of the conference costs. There's no registration fee. People just have to pay for their travel and lodging. But we bring in national speakers. There's interactive sessions. There's often reports coming out of it and connections made and facilitated. And so the goal there is really just we've got this incredible group of 10 communities doing all this work and learning all these things, but they're also finding other things they want to learn, and they organize a conference every year to share all that with the rest of their peers in the field in the state. Next slide, Robert. The benefits of this kind of grant approach, again, it's not just the longevity of the grant, but it's a long period, substantial grant to the backbone efforts in 10 communities, combined with the capacity building, the learning community, the academic partner, the annual conference, a variety of supports. In the first year, what they found is the implementation plans and proposals were much stronger and defined clearer results and strategies, and truly had much more community engagement than typical proposals would. They found that groups are really adjusting their implementation based on learning, and learning not just from their work, but from each other as they make progress. Having 8 years, a lot of groups have had to adjust their strategies as they go, and that's something that they're able to do based on, again, the data and the work that they're doing using collective impact. And finally, I think one of the big things is at the end of 8 years, having tried these very different approaches, because each community kind of developed its own approach to what population level measure they were going to move and what strategies, the endowment will have a set of experiments, if you will, on what kinds of things actually moved population change. And they'll be able to see what was most impactful and what might be replicable, while we already know that lots of impact is happening. I'll just add that we had, in one of the activities we did the last 2 days, we'd asked people about what already have they built that's sustaining, and will be there after they finish these projects. And the number of things they've already implemented that are sustainable are huge. And again, they're in year 4 right now, and it's amazing because they're thinking, they hold a long view as they do their work. They're not thinking of trying to just get things done in 2 years or 3 years. They're thinking over time, and that's allowed them to really build things that are lasting and sustainable. Next slide, please. There were also 4 challenges we encountered in this process as we did it. The first was we used a result-based planning process for this to develop the strategies. And it was challenging because in behavioral health, population level indicators are very difficult to come by. And so it felt at times like we're struggling to get the results and strategies right because the indicators around behavioral health are not great in regions. We were able to find solutions, but if we were doing this again, we would have probably done the research on the front end and offered sites a menu of potential results and measures they could have used. The second was adapting the model equitably to a sovereign tribe. The Lac du Flambeau tribe in northern Wisconsin was a grantee in this project, and frankly, some of the models that we used, both for the structure of the collective impact and some of the models for the culture and training of it, weren't a great fit with their own culture and heritage and history. And so we had to find ways to adapt that without creating a slippery slope where everyone started to claim that we're unique and different. They truly were unique and different. And we had to, practicing equity in this regard meant meeting them where they were and recognizing that they started in a very different place than other communities because of their history and culture, and frankly, because of the history of institutions imposing models on them that have done great harm. And so for the foundation to work with them, we had to adapt and work differently. The third is that we had started the learning community before all the coalitions had hired their core staff. And the timeline that it took for everyone to hire all their staff took far longer than anticipated. And having everyone there at the beginning would have helped, because I think some people came in a third or halfway through the year and missed a lot of the orientation and front-end table setting that led them kind of to be a little more confused when they entered the process. And the final challenge was just that the design of the curriculum and the process was done after selecting the grantees. And there was some resistance to people to the models. And again, if before they applied, they had known this is what you're signing up for in terms of using a result-based process, in terms of some of the cultural work we were expecting and the community engagement things, that people would have been clear what they were getting into at the front end. But overall, all these were very soluble, and frankly, as we closed up the group yesterday, we even have people cry at these learning communities when they leave each other. The sense of community and connection is very strong, and the amount of learning and development they've had has been exceptional. Let's move to the next slide, which is just going to bring us to questions. And I'm going to start with just a couple questions to Christina and Tim, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to help curate the questions that you are typing into the chat section. And the first question I have is, how did you get a board of directors to lock up $20 million for 8 years? And to have comfort with letting go, because that's really a big part of it, is letting go. Grant makers like to give 2 or 3 years because it gives them more control, and it gives them a greater feeling of control and comfort, knowing that they can and that they'll have other opportunities to use those resources in other ways if it's not working. You locked them in for 8 years. How did you get them comfortable with doing that, with that amount of money?
Well, Paul, I would offer that working with our board to come to this space, it actually wasn't that hard. We're in a space where our board is a working board, and they worked lockstep with us on this entire planning process and helped us to really shape and come to agreement on the process and the methods we would use for this. They did have some discomfort, but they also recognized that our years of funding that led up to this, we noticed that our funding base, Wisconsin, was really riddled with the skeletons of funded programs that died when the funding died, and recognizing that 2 years to tackle these really wicked problems is just insufficient, as well as just providing funding alone is insufficient for such a wicked problem. We know that mental health and behavioral health and the issues our communities are facing, they're not solved with a 2-year program. They're not solved with an intervention. They're coupled with social determinants of health and very complex issues like racism and poverty and lack of education and a number of other issues. So we knew that we had to do something at a much more substantial rate than our previous funding had been at. So our board was along with us the entire way. We had a lot, probably a year or two of planning and thinking about this and working through the different scenarios and landed here with the board.
Tim, as a program officer, what's made this work for you? And specifically, and also talk a little bit about what you see and what you're getting from these groups versus groups that may be only getting 2 years of funding or one. Do you see a difference in how these groups are thinking and working? And how does it work for you as a program officer to have this kind of commitment and partnership?
Yeah, I think definitely the long-term nature of the funding has provided an opportunity that didn't previously exist, and an opportunity that many other grantees are not able to access. The first year of just funded learning and planning, I think we were very pleased to be able to offer that, because what we asked our applicants to do is propose a population level indicator to drive some movement towards behavioral health improvement, and that's difficult to find. The data is a mess. Strategies need to be developed and identified, partners identified and engaged, and that really takes a lot of time. So then moving into our implementation phase, I think there's a little bit more breathing room where the pressure wasn't on already in years 1 or 2 to start producing long-term outcomes. And we were really looking for even some of the shorter process outcomes as indicators of success. And then coupled that with the learning community and all the capacity building opportunities, I think it's really rounded out the approach whereby the funded projects can feel confident in moving forward and adapting as necessary, on leaning on one another and accessing the capacity building opportunities to propel their work forward.
Jennifer, do you have some questions from the field to share?
Hi, everyone. Yes, lots of awesome questions coming in. So let's start working our way through them.
Great.
So it seems like this work is being done with large dollar investment. Do you believe this work could be replicated using a smaller budget? Or what would you have for folks that have smaller budgets?
Well, one thing I would offer too is the $20 million investment, it is actually part of the story. So this isn't necessarily helping with this question, but we also invest quite a bit of resources from the endowment side outside of just those grant dollars. So having Tim's time as dedicated program officer on this work, as well as the other financial resources we put into this in terms of our annual summit costs quite a bit of money because we make that free for the participants, as well as the our quarterly learning communities. We pick up the cost for all of those, and technical assistance providers to our grantees, there's also costs to those that we pick up. So in fact, there's a lot, in having this model, there's also a lot of resources that the endowment has to pile on top of those grant awards. So yes, potentially doing it at a smaller award amount to the grantees is definitely possible. However, the investment on top of those grants from the foundation is critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and someone actually asked if you have an estimated dollar amount of the value of the technical assistance and the other kind of wraparound support. I don't know if that's something you are able or willing to share.
Over the 8 years, is it about $1 million?
It would be north of $1 million, including all of staff time that goes into it here, as well as the capacity building opportunities, the technical
annual summits,
our meeting expenses, because we do, have a lot of expenses in travel in that regard. So
it's 40 learning community meetings over the 8 years,
correct,
I think.
Yeah.
So it's a lot.
So it's approximately, if I had to ballpark it, about $150,000 a year for all of those extra costs that are not made in grants. That's just administrative budget costs.
Got it. And so just as a sense of scale, what percent or portion of your overall budget goes towards this program?
So the overall operating budget, let's see. So I would say our overall operating budget is about in the ballpark of $2 million annually.
And your total grant making budget of the foundations?
Well,
about a tenth of that?
Yeah. So we fluctuate, but for the endowment as a whole, across all of our funding mechanisms, we average about $17 million in grants a year.
And then administrative, so probably it's about 10% of your total budget as a foundation is spent on this program.
And maybe one other comment I can make about the kind of the cost of doing business and maybe different opportunities or options. So one of the things that we required, one of our requirements of application was we asked our applicants to designate a 1.0 FTE, so a full-time project director or coordinator. As in addition, we asked for up to a 0.5 FTE evaluator. So each project has their own evaluation capacity built in. The reason why we wanted a full-time project director or coordinator on each project was so that they could come to these learning community meetings, that they could dedicate the time and the space to make that happen. In some of our other funding opportunities, which don't have that requirement, people are splitting time amongst a number of different projects, and so it's often easy to say, "Sorry, can't make it to that meeting. That's only a quarter of my time, and I have other priorities I have to juggle." In dedicating full-time staff, that kind of eliminates some of those. It makes it easier for everyone to meet and to dedicate the time and attention that's required to build their coalitions locally. And then in addition to that, I would offer, we do have other learning and capacity building opportunities at AHW that aren't as intensive and that don't require as many resources. So we, for example, in our policy systems and environmental change work, all the grantees come together periodically for learning cohort meetings. And so they're kind of in a similar vein, they're to promote exchange of knowledge, to promote capacity building opportunities, to share tools, resources, et cetera. It's just not on the same scale and not at the same level of involvement. So there are opportunities to do this type of work, but it might be wider and thinner than deeper.
Great, thank you. Folks are interested in learning a little bit more about the work that's actually happening across the 10 communities. And so a couple related questions. Could you talk a little bit about the different types of communities that are engaged? What are one or two examples of that behavioral health indicator that folks may be focused on moving? And then also, if you could talk a little bit about more about your selection process, how you landed on those 10 communities.
Sure. Yeah, I can start with that. So we have 10 community coalitions that are spread out across the state. On one of the previous slides, it shows a map of the geographic distribution of those projects, and so they pretty much cover the corners of the state, which we're very pleased to see. Obviously, we'd like that whole graphic filled in, but we did have limited funds. In terms of the types of projects, so if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, so projects 7 and 9, 9 is Milwaukee, the largest urban center in the state, and then just below us, number 7 is Racine, which is also an urban type project. Some of our projects are very rural. So for example, the 2 up in the north, project number 10 is based in Ashland on the shores of Lake Superior, and then the project number 5 is the Lac de Flambeau tribe. Very small in terms of population relative to the larger urban centers. And then the other projects kind of fall somewhere in between there. So smaller cities and or broader rural projects that span 1 or more counties. In terms of what they're trying to accomplish, approximately half of our groups are focused on youth mental health. And the population level indicator they have selected, it relates in some way to the decrease of the number of youth at risk for mental health illness. And as measured by the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, the YRBS. And so that opportunity, that survey and that data is released periodically, although there's been some challenges in the terms of its administration and just the process of that over the last couple of years. But they use that data point to guide their work. And what we really say about those indicators is we look at them as their guiding star, so they're North Star of the project. And along the way, there are a number of other measures that we're looking at, and they have a full evaluation model that's been developed to demonstrate their success towards achieving that population level indicator. So among each of their individually developed project strategies, we have asked for measurements, baselines, and targets to demonstrate progress.
Terrific. Someone asked if there's a website that actually has detail on all of the 10 coalition projects.
So the AHW website does have information. We can provide the direct link likely after the webinar to maybe include it at the end. But there is a landing page for the initiative, which should allow those interested to shuffle through the different projects and see what each is up to.
Terrific. One of the things I think is really interesting, and Paul, you alluded to this, is that these are, by philanthropy standards, very long-term, 8-year commitments, and a lot of these indicators may take even longer than 8 years. And so the groups have been very thoughtful from day one in thinking about their sustainability. And so I think folks would be really interested in hearing more about how groups and you all, as well as the coalitions, have been approaching their sustainability from the start. One specific question along this lines is if anyone's looking into contractual relationships, for example, with health payers or other funding streams. So perhaps both sustainability, new funding mechanisms, or other sustainability approaches.
Sure. There's a few different ways we could go with that question. In terms of just sustainability in general and the distal nature of some of the outcomes that we're looking to be achieved, I think we as funders recognize that some of the impact will happen even beyond the 8-year term. And we're okay with that. Another major piece of our work has been our investment in policy systems and environmental changes. We've moved away from funding interventions a long time ago, and so we've already had a focus on, well, what type of work can actually be sustained? And so what we've asked our partners to do, and they all speak the language very fluently of policy and systems changes, to examine what in your local communities can be altered so that this work can be sustained. We focus less on working with payers or reimbursement rates. One of our actually restrictions as a funder are imposed on us from external our oversight bodies is we are prohibited from funding any lobbying. So that any of those efforts are automatically off the table. So when we talk about policy change, we really focus on small p policy. What can you change within an organization, within a culture, within a community? One great example was just the other day in La Crosse during our learning community meeting. One of the great aspects of traveling around the state and letting each of these groups host the learning community meeting is that they can show off what they've been up to. And our local host brought in a panel of individuals from the school districts, from the YMCA, as well as the police department, who has enacted a police district-wide focus on mental health first aid training. The chief of police was there in uniform, talking about how much this project has meant to him and his officers. That is what we mean by sustainability. If this project had to close tomorrow, which it won't, but if it had to close, that work will continue because there's already buy-in from individuals on the ground. And that's what we really try to encourage our partners to think about.
And just two things that emphasize there. One is that it's a health conversion foundation created from a sale, the creation of a Blue Cross Blue Shield from for-profit to from nonprofit to for-profit. Mm-hmm. And our state government established the endowment and put rules on it that other foundations don't have. So I just want to clarify that it's not that you don't just have the normal rules that a foundation has. You actually were a foundation created by the state, and the state put additional rules on that. And secondly, that there's been a big emphasis on systems change throughout the project. And last year at the summit, we had this great keynote. His name was John Kania, and he came and talked about the waters of system change. But we've done a number of things to bring kind of systems change to the forefront of the work and look at it not just through policy, but through the lens of narratives around stigma and things like that, and how systems and groups work together, including the police and the schools and behavioral health providers, and how power operates in communities in terms of parent voice driving decision making in Milwaukee in a way it didn't before, or resource flows and policies, and of course, administrative rules and things. So the groups have been thinking of system change more broadly and using that kind of pyramid model from the waters of system change, which was a previous webinar, to share those ideas.
Yeah, I would just add that with all of our funding mechanisms, we really try to re-emphasize that sustainability is not grant writing, but sustainability is that transformative change that has lasting effect in the community.
Great, thank you. And someone wanted the repeat of the speaker that Paul cited. That's John Kania, who is a co-author of an article called The Water of Systems Change that presents a pretty concrete framework for thinking about systems change. It was co-authored also with Mark Kramer and Peter Senge, and that's a body of work that our organization has actually done a few webinars on, and definitely recommend reading that piece if you are interested in more.
Absolutely. I also recommend John's other article called Collective Impact.
Fair enough. Yes, John was one of the original authors of the Collective Impact articles, many Collective Impact articles, including the original frame. Thanks, Paul. Folks are interested in understanding what kind of communication and learning tools are used to keep all the coalitions sort of informed and learning and participating beyond just the real-time convenings.
Sure. We've actually struggled with developing an online platform to share resources for different reasons. For example, I think where it's at now is some type of Google Drive, shared drive. But even then, some of our projects, based on what organizations they work with, have a firewall that doesn't allow access to that. So there's been some technical issues in being able to promote communication. Really, the learning community meeting is kind of the tip of the spear when it comes to that.
But the academic partner does a monthly email to all the learning community where they collect information from all the sites and share it back with the group. So there's a monthly email that everyone gets that kind of updates on what's going on across all the regions. Yeah.
So there's a newsletter. So there's also regular check-in calls with our faculty connect with our groups, and there are paired calls so that they have an opportunity to hear over a phone call what other people are up to in terms of their day-to-day work and what kind of resources, tools they have to overcome some of the challenges that they're facing. In addition, I meet with all these projects regularly. And so then a lot of times I'm playing matchmaker and saying like, oh, you've encountered this challenge, you should talk to the community across the state here because they've experienced a similar issue, and this is how they've chosen to address that. The other thing that I have to say, because it's one of my favorite things to say about this project, is now we're almost 4 years in. All of these great people love to talk behind my back, and I really appreciate that. They can bypass us entirely. They do. They meet with one another. They drive to each other's communities, sometimes a 6-hour drive clear across the state. They are free to pick up the phone and call each other. And really that culture has been developed through those in-person meetings at the learning community. I mean, it's great to see when everyone's arriving and leaving, the hugs and the check-ins with one another, and they really have open channels of communication amongst themselves.
One of the sites just had a mini conference in their region, and I think like 6 of the others showed up at it or something. And so it's really, they're constantly supporting and connecting with each other.
Cool. And so shifting gears a little, could you talk a little bit about how you are evaluating the program overall? And then you also mentioned that the individual coalitions have their own evaluations. So folks are interested in learning more about how evaluation plays out both for the foundation as well as at the coalition level.
Sure. There's probably 3 main levels of evaluation. The first would be within each of the projects. As I mentioned, we have required that they have some in-house evaluation capacity. And really, those individuals do a couple things. One, they kind of monitor progress towards the activities that are being conducted, as well as measuring towards the benchmarks that have been set for each of the strategies. And we really wanted to make sure that there was some dedicated staff time in order to conduct those types of local evaluation activities. We still are, as most funders do, we require annual progress reports. And so we do, receive that information at least annually. And I would also say that the evaluators have gone much farther beyond just simply evaluating, and they're actually they really get their hands dirty with the day-to-day work of the project. Then secondly, our MCW academic partner team has been tasked with looking at some of the global evaluation activities. So that would include they're using a process of implementation science to take a look at what is working in the different communities with an eye towards how can they share back those lessons learned, so that both in real time these grantees can make adjustments, and then down the road we can share that information with others as well. And I would say, there's always a lag time with the evaluation, and so we're hoping to accelerate those processes in the near future. And then finally, I think the third level of evaluation is our own type of assessment of the work. And a lot of that is, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, sometimes it's more art than science, but we look towards some of the stories that are coming out of the work of the individual projects. And actually we've altered our format of how we share back progress with our board instead of just providing a one or 2 page summary of each project. We try to present some of the good work they're doing and show in our PowerPoint, show some pictures and stories so that we can get a sense for the direction that these individual projects are going.
Terrific. I'm going to use my moderator privilege to ask a question of my own. I was really interested, Paul, in your mentioning the work with the sovereign tribe and how a lot of the approach needed to be adapted in that tribal context. And that's something I'd love to hear a little bit more about. What type of adaptations were pursued in order to be culturally responsive and relevant?
I think that I think in a few ways. I think that the results-based, data-driven process we were using was one that there was a fair amount of resistance to, not in terms of like the content as much as in the context of it, of what they were being asked. And there's issues of data in tribal communities is often a dirty word, just because a lot of times data has been pulled from those communities to create harm to them. And a lot of people come in to gather data and have historically to create harm. And so it was important to recognize that we were, and that some of the processes we were asking groups to do were pretty fast. And their process needed to be slowed down a little bit and allow more for conversation. And a big piece was their focus is really on instilling culture as a form of prevention, and reconnecting people to language and culture and history as a way of prevention for young people. And it makes a lot of sense, and it's an incredible effort, to be honest. Our visit last year was I think transformative. Everyone who was there in terms of understanding it. But I think just the model and the way of working with them had to be different. And it was actually Brian, our director there, who at one point said, "What would the equity play be to meet us where we are?" And he was right, that we were expecting them to come in and work in the way the other groups did, and frankly, what they considered a more Western approach, where their approach to time, their approach to measurement and things were different. And so the decision was made that it was important to both have this project that had a lot of promise, and also to learn about, for the endowment, I think, to learn about working with a tribal community. And therefore, we had to kind of operate a little bit differently with them than with the other grantees. I don't know, maybe you two can share a little more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we even went as far as to look at a MOU for data sharing. So to make it clear that we're not collecting information in a way that could potentially harm them down the road. I think that's an important aspect. In our application process, we actually utilize a three-phase application process. Phase 2 of that is an in-person pitch presentation, and so we have all these groups coming from all around the state, and it's very regimented, and logistically, it's kind of a challenge to say, each, and it's in front of our board of directors, who are all very busy individuals, and we have it timed out with the precision of our best working watch. And but part of their pitch was they do an invocation and a protocol in their native language at the beginning. Well, when do we start the clock? Does that start when the invocation starts? Well, then they'll eat 2 minutes. They also brought in a drum circle. They brought in a 4.5-hour drive. They brought in down one-way drive. They brought down a group of youth to do a drum circle. Again, we're not going to start the clock when at the sound of the first drum, but we're going to provide and accommodate that process into our process, and make adjustments as necessary.
Yeah, so I think it's just, again, and I think the challenge for any grant maker in that regard, or any, in my case, facilitator, is how do you make exception without that being a slippery slope where then everyone wants an exception? And I think we were just very clear that this was a very distinct cultural and equity play that we were making, and that's why. And that there were very specific reasons for it, and not an invitation to other communities to opt out of things or to bend time and other things. We were more meeting them where they were than creating a new standard for everybody.
Yeah, it was definitely our practice into adding equity into our funding practices and our decision-making practices.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to read one piece here that is a comment from someone on the line that was part of the learning community in Racine County and can attest to the value of this model that it provides for addressing community level change. Shout out to Paul, Christina, and Tim for providing amazing resources and support at every turn. So I wanted to make sure to share that comment with all three of you. But let's see, back to our questions. We definitely still have more. Someone was interested.
Your progress report is looking really good, Racine.
I think she said former, so it might be Jackie, our person. Yeah.
I will leave that anonymous to keep you guessing. Someone wanted to hear more specifics around the kind of system changes that are happening in community. So if you could speak to, one or two specific examples, I think people would find that really interesting.
Sure. So maybe just kind of to put a pin maybe on our discussion about Lac de Flambeau and the work up there. So as Paul mentioned, what their population level indicator is on actually reducing excessive drinking. But their primary strategy is to promote culture as a form of resilience among their community. So they've developed this amazing curriculum called family circles, whereby they really bring groups of families together to learn together, to promote their culture, to learn the language, and it's funded by AHW, to learn the language, to learn the culture, to reconnect with who they are as a people. That is systems change. As our partners described it, it's so old that it's new. I mean, it's been around, the culture for so long, but that they're bringing that back, and really by promoting that and by getting the buy-in from tribal council, which now they do in all of the tribal agencies up on the reservation, that program will live on beyond the term of our funding. A couple other examples would be several of our projects are utilizing an online resource sharing platform to promote access to mental health services within their communities. And a lot of times what that looks like is that on our budgets, we will fund the startup or the initiation of the website cost, but that they have to develop local resources for the annual maintenance costs. So moving forward, should those resources be available, the local communities will have to determine how best to fund those. And so there will be some sustainability there as well, because several of those projects have already found those funding streams to maintain those projects. In a lot of cases, we've funded the development of curriculum, as well as a lot of trained trainers on different protocols, including, for example, in the Fox Cities. So that's the project in and around Appleton, Wisconsin, Sources of Strength. So now there are several Sources of Strength trained trainers who, beyond the term of this project, will be able to continue providing the support to local school districts so that they can continue to work with their youth to ensure that these activities can continue.
They've worked with police departments in several communities to shift how they address mental health crises and where they take people and their partnerships with communities. A lot of narrative change, a lot of focus on changing stigma. There's a lot of stigma around, obviously around mental health and addressing that. In one community, they got 3 medical systems to work together in a way they hadn't before. And so the actual, competing medical systems are connecting around how to make sure that there's more services in the community. So just a variety of ways, again, beyond public policy. There is a group of people from the learning community who have self-organized around working on larger policy issues together. And again, that speaks to what Tim said earlier in terms of they're self-organizing as well, that they are working on other kind of policy and systems change work collectively outside the learning community as kind of an ad hoc committee they've formed. But a variety of ways that they're looking at system changes, again, across that whole pyramid from the waters of systems change.
Great. So someone from a CBO on the webinar is curious if you have advice on how to present to funders in order to attain funding for collective impact and systems change type work. So what advice would you give to make the case, not necessarily even for the long term, but for funding collective impact and systems change work?
Well, I would say it really depends on the philosophy of that philanthropy. So 10 years ago, as a funder, we probably wouldn't have been as interested in that because we were much more interested in funding at that time interventions with a distinct start and stop time. And it was okay at that time that the sustainability plan was to ask us for more funding to do more of that intervention. So if the foundation, the funder that you're approaching has that type of funding philosophy, it would be difficult for them to take this into their portfolio. However, I do think that funders across the nation are are catching on to the system change philosophy and understanding the greater impact that and the sustained transformative impact that occurs from system change, and the fact that much of the work that needs to be done in our country is rooted in those social determinants, and they are wicked problems, and they cannot be solved in short-term, low-cost funding. So if a foundation is interested in seeing great impact, this, would be a good method for them to appreciate that it takes more than just small time and small money.
Great. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. Someone is curious, other funders on the line are curious if you have initial RFPs or sort of internal process documents that you might be willing to share. If so, we can connect folks after. But if there is something that you have on hand that you might be willing to share with some other folks on the line?
Yeah, we'd be happy to share the RFA that was put out a number of years ago now, that was used for these groups to propose their work.
Great. So I'm just going to ask this as the last question. How have you handled any situations where a project isn't thriving and needs some sort of shifting, whether that's to another partner or a different way of going about their work? How have you handled working with challenges?
Yeah, and potentially it's because of our roots here at a medical research facility that we definitely have an appreciation of all the elements of research, and that while you might propose to go down lane A, the nature of especially community-based work is that you will zigzag during that work, and it's not always a straight path. So we actually help to counsel our funded entities up front to plan for that and to have that buffer. And that's also why we have the learning community, as well as we have one of our capacity building efforts is, we call them our TAPs, our technical assistance partners. So that's an additional resource that we apply. It doesn't cost our grantees anything. We pick up the cost for that project to work with someone who has expertise in whatever roadblock they're facing, so that not to hire someone to do the work for them, but to help them think about their issue differently and maybe offer some different tools or methods for getting over that roadblock.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'd just add real quick there, in terms of these specific projects, fortunately so far everyone is on target, and especially for what their main bread and butter outcomes are. Each of these projects has multiple strategies, and what I like to say is that not all strategies are created equal. So if you hit number 1 and 2, and that's what we're really funding you to do, great. And then strategies 3 or 4 might have been icing on the cake, and if you're not making terrific progress towards those, that's okay.
Great,
and there have been some staff changes as is inevitable over a 4-year period. Most of those have been voluntary and just kind of healthy transitions, and we've transitioned new people in, and they've been welcome to become part of the community. It's funny, I'm just thinking of a few of the people who are second project directors, who I forget that they haven't been there since the beginning because they're so central to the work. And so there have been staff changes, but no projects that have created any concerns. And I think in a way, the intensity of that first year would have flagged that potentially from happening. I think that the amount of work they put into the design of their project and having several rounds of design with their peers in the group allowed us to really work with them on plans that had a much better chance and likelihood of maintaining progress.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, Tim, and Christina, on behalf of all of the folks who joined today, I really want to thank you for not only your time today, but the incredible work that you're leading and the innovative and thoughtful way that you're going about doing such important work in the state of Wisconsin. So thank you so much. I have a few just closing notes for the audience, but we're so grateful to have had you with us. So we do have one more webinar for our network in 2019. This one promises to be super interesting. Key factors for success and collective impact, evaluation findings from the field. We will have joining us folks from the evaluation organization Equal Measure, as well as the Strive Together Network, to talk about a 3-year evaluation that Equal Measure and Strive partnered together on, and some very rigorous evaluation findings that are quite promising and helpful for the field. So please do join us. We also have registration open for our May 2020 convening in the Twin Cities. This event does sell out every year, so if you're considering attending, we'd encourage you never too soon to sign up. We will continue adding to the posted agenda over the coming weeks and hope that many of you can join us. So with that, I will just say thank you again and wish everyone a good afternoon and a happy beginning to the holiday season. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for calling in.